Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We are back with another episode of Daily Palantir. It is Monday, February 19th, and in the United States of America, we have President's Day, and so the market is not open. I've been questioning the nature of my existence for the past 5 hours. At 9:42 a.m., I realized we should be 12 minutes into the market open from 9:30, and that wasn't happening. So this is going to be more of a chill episode, nothing that crazy. I want to do two things in this episode. Shout out to everyone who is tuning in on President's Day. Hopefully you guys are having a good long weekend in the States and enjoying spending some time with your family. I want to go through a couple of news headlines with Palantir. Something around bootcamps, and then second of all, around institutional ownership that is picking up in the company pretty dramatically. And I want to share some of the stuff that I've tweeted about over the weekend. If you're not following me on Twitter, please make sure you follow me on Twitter in the description. I tweeted a lot about different institutional investors and how much they've increased their allocation to Palantir. And then we're going to react to Palantir's Alex Karp at this conference he was at in Germany, talking about data security, privacy, all this stuff. Palantir Vision, shout out to Jackson, another great Palantir YouTuber, basically got 13 minutes of his entire compilation altogether. And so I've seen a little bit of it, but not the entire thing. So the latter half of this video is just going to be me reacting to that entire video and giving my thoughts on Karp, basically clowning some of the people there in regards to some of the stuff they said about China and a bunch of other things. So this is going to be a chill episode. Hope you guys are enjoying. We didn't have any market open stream today, so really my entire life has been kind of just like, what am I doing today? I need the market to be open. That market open is one of the things that gives me the fuel to live, the will to live, the happiness to live. But regardless, we still got Palantir to analyze, so let's get into it. All right, so let's start off with Palantir 13F institutional disclosures. A lot of these firms ended up buying in Q4 2023. They are reporting as of February 14th, 2024. And the reason for that is because there's a 45 delay that they have from when they buy to when they report. So maybe some of these firms sold these shares. Maybe these firms bought even more shares. But the point is, I wanted to highlight from Fintel, Whale Wisdom. Those are the two sources I used to try to compile all this data and aggregate it. What are the firms that are buying a lot of shares? So for example, a company like SquarePoint's adding 1.3 million shares of Palantir, likely around October, November, December. Yes, and now they have 6.1 million shares. Yes, Palantir has gone up 50%. Did they sell some? Maybe. But if you're an institutional investor and you're really kind of developing a thesis and you're adding a company as part of a portfolio, I mean, I think the far majority of them are not going to sell just because it goes from 16 to 24, especially when the jump from 16 to 24, even if it's a little bit stretched, was justified, right? This was not a meme stock sort of frenzy. This was company put up numbers, entire narrative changed, growth is coming, AI is here, the demand is there, Karp saying demand's off the chart. So when you're an institutional investor and you're hearing Karp say some of this stuff and you're realizing that you have 6 million shares and you got a bunch of them at 16, 17 bucks, flipping it at 24 is not really the MO here, especially for your clients that are putting a lot of money into a fund, right? You want to give them an outsized return. I've actually talked to a couple of these fund managers back in Texas who, in the United States, who are managing $40 million, and, you know, they're pretty bullish, and Karp only made them more bullish. They loaded up around $8, $9. So you might sell some here and there, but you're not going to see massive, massive sell-offs just because the stock has gone up. So what I tried to do is compile as many as I could to try to showcase that institutional investors are buying, and they're buying pretty heavily. So here you go. Schroeder Investment Management Group added 332,000 shares, SquarePoint's 1.3 million, Wally Trading 548,000, State Street 2.8 million. I mean, there's a lot of these. I quote tweeted this with even more. You got Northwestern Mutual Wealth Management, 448,000, CBC World Markets Group, 51,000. And then I did it again, another quote tweet, right? You got Lord Abbott and Company initiated a position of 1.9 million, Harvest Investment 70,000. A lot of these were initiated for the first time. So like this one initiated a position of 1.9 million, this one initiated a position of 34,000. And then a lot of them added. Avia PLC added 679,000, bringing their total to 858,000. I'll leave all these tweets in the description so you guys can read them and kind of go through the numbers as you want. But the point is, there is larger institutional ownership happening in the world of Palantir. And we can look at this right here. This is a chart from Fintel, which aggregates a lot of the institutional ownership data when it comes to Palantir. And as you can see, if you look at this final bar, we are headed closer to that 40% range. Now, some things that I've seen put us at 41% from the Bloomberg terminal. So I think it's safe to assume we were at like 38, now we're closer to 41%, which is closing in on a little bit over 900 million shares of Palantir. There's about 2.1 billion shares outstanding. So we're not at officially 50%, right? You would need close to about 1.1 billion shares outstanding for that to happen. But we're getting there with 40%. And the key here is if this can get to 60%. A stock that really has 60% institutional ownership, from my understanding, starts to have a bit of a floor to the company in terms of these institutions are not willing to sell out for cheap. You know, they might have a bad couple quarters, but they have a long-term thesis. That's why they invested in the first place. There's a lot more guardrails towards how they think about their investment thesis. And on top of that, when you have a company that's actually performing, so in this case of Palantir, they are profitable, which is a big criteria for a lot of institutional investors. And they are growing U.S. commercial 70% year over year. That's much higher than sort of that 35% range a lot of these high growth tech investors want. Even if top line's not at 35%, if you see certain segments of the business that are expanding and there is a bold narrative for how that expansion is going to happen, then obviously the toots will give you the benefit of the doubt. Then obviously the institutions can give you the benefit of the doubt and potentially buy your stock. So I think what we're seeing right now is a pretty bullish sentiment overall in terms of how institutions are thinking about Palantir and why they want their allocation to be substantially higher than it was before we were in before Q4 earnings. Now, one other thing that's really important here is obviously AI. So the street wants AI exposure. We know the street wants AI exposure. Conventionally, is Palantir a bit overvalued given it's, you know, approaching 55 billion and it's going to be doing 2 billion in revenue? It's like, yes, like 60 times price to free cash flow. It's starting to get a little up there. I think NVIDIA, as we've talked about on this channel, is going to determine everything on Wednesday. That's going to be a very important live stream after market close. Is NVIDIA going to be able to say that AI demand is expanding, GPU demand is expanding, chip demand is expanding, data center revenue demand is expanding, even if it's not directly one-to-one correlated with Palantir, because it's in that AI bucket in the market and the algorithms are perceptual and they trade with trends. If NVIDIA has a bad quarter, I think there will be some impact on Palantir, even if it's not monumental. If NVIDIA has a great quarter, that could also give Palantir a leg up, even though maybe Palantir doesn't deserve to have a leg up just because NVIDIA had a good quarter. This is kind of just irrational in terms of what's going on with AI exposure, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with NVIDIA. But the point is, AI is required in institutional funds. AI is needed in funds, and if fintech's not getting you the return, i.e. PayPal, if crypto is a little bit too scary for a lot of these institutional investors to get into, you know, Coinbase, MicroStrategy, CleanSpark, these Bitcoin miners, they just don't want to touch that stuff. And then large cap tech, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, they're up almost 60 to 70% over 2023. So it's like, how much more juice is there left in that lemon to squeeze? Then, well, you got to go to smaller companies like Palantir, which at 50 billion is not necessarily small, but it's definitely not a $3 trillion company. And it's in the space that is not only the space that is in high demand, but a space that every research report we see is saying is going to be worth, you know, many, many trillions over the next 20 years, just given the nature of how that industrial revolution around AI is happening. And if that's the case, Palantir is a prime candidate. We've seen consolidation in this 23 to 25 range so far. I think we need definitely like another month or two to really say we're out beyond the 20s, meaning we're likely not going to see below 20 again. I would say at least 2 months of consolidating from this 22 to 25 range. And if that's the case, then yeah, we're in a whole new valuation model for Palantir. And anyone who has an average below 20 could probably feel very confident they have a strong margin of safety, because it's likely that we're not going to see that again, barring something super macroeconomic or something internally with the company, like they missed the Titan contract or they don't get certain deals, etc. So as of now, it seems really exciting. The macro is holding up. We got pretty bad CPI and housing data on Friday, but that still didn't really wreck the markets per se. And so I think everything depends on NVIDIA earnings. But so far, these institutional investors are excited and they are buying Palantir. All right, next thing I wanted to show real quick is a great post on Bootcamps that are expanding. So this is from a good Twitter account I'll put in the description as well, Lord Harrigroom. And as you can see, they got some screenshots from LinkedIn from Palantir saying that London is going to have a bootcamp around insurance and AIP. So I would imagine insurance companies and how they can leverage AI platforms. And then Zurich in Switzerland is also going to be having an insurance AIP bootcamp. One of them is going to be happening on March 22nd. One of them is going to be happening on April 4th in 2024. So this is exciting because international commercial growth has not been the best for Palantir. U.S. commercial obviously has been the best. International government growth also has not been the best. So if these boot camps can start expanding all across the world, all throughout Asia, all throughout Europe, obviously all in North America, we are going to start to see some broader, conversions if the AIP bootcamps are good, which, so far we've seen some pretty damn good conversions at 103 deals in Q4. That means they got at least one deal a day in Q4 in 90 days, which is absolutely incredible. And if they expand internationally, I mean, the US is obviously demanding AI platforms, but India's going to want AI. Switzerland's going to want AI. I would imagine London, where Palantir's headquarters are for AI, are going to want more AIP platforms. So when you have a lot of these countries all at once scaling with bootcamps, it doesn't mean the conversion is super high on those. I mean, the conversion could be 10, 15%, which isn't the best. But if you're doing 1,000 bootcamps a month, if you're doing, 1,500 boot camps every 5 months. Like, there's a lot of momentum there for that to expand. And if that momentum starts expanding, we're going to see more clients, we're going to see more customers, we're going to see more top line growth. And what's the most important is we're going to see more international commercial growth. Because if that international commercial can subsidize the lack of government growth, not only internationally, but in the US, and you've got commercial itself doing well, not just US commercial, which is growing 33% year over year. But if that can get to 40, 45%, that can offset a lot of the government slowdowns. And eventually the government, will be back and reaccelerate. And then you're going to have a business that's just firing on all cylinders. And hopefully that was sandbagged in the Q4 guidance. So the fact that we're expanding the boot camps, we had the Accenture boot camp in India. I reported that in December. So that was really exciting as well. Now we just got to see more and more of those boot camps happening, more and more of our consulting partners having boot camps with Palantir. And we should see that customer count start to go up. All right, so last thing we're going to do is react to Alex Karp at the Munich Security Conference. This was February 2024. Palantir Vision put a 12-minute compilation of everything he said. The first minute is really interesting because Karp is basically arguing with this guy who's saying that we're allowed to sell technology to China and nothing's wrong with that. And Karp is basically going to say, I don't know if that's the case. That's the only clip I've seen so far. The rest of it I haven't seen, so we're going to react to it together. Here we go. Here is the new stuff that Karp has said.
I think
That's purposely naive.
if there is a way
You're saying your edge technology will not be used as a weapon. It's one of the most interesting ways to build a weapon.
No, you misunderstand me. What I'm saying is...
I correctly understand you.
No, what I'm saying is the use cases with consumers, if there is a regulatory environment which the Western world considers reasonable, to align that with inputs from China, there is no harm of doing this. That is not about the product getting there. It's about understanding a regulatory environment.
It's like camels. It's like a famous way of creating a precedent. Obviously, what you're really saying is you plan to sell technology that you view as consumer that's clearly dual purpose to a nation that you're adversary with. By the way, that's a perspective, and you should make that argument. But you're trying to make two arguments at once. And I'm just telling you, feel free to make that argument. I respect you for it, especially if you actually made it. I'm making the other argument, and I'm going to fight for the other argument. And America is behind me on this.
I'm just happy I'm the moderator.
What's exciting about that little portion right there is Karp's basically saying, hey, you're not even making an argument. You're tiptoeing around it. If you really think you can make consumer products and then sell them to China and they're not going to do anything wrong with that, then okay, that's a perspective. That's kind of it's a nice way of saying, okay, that's a dumb argument, but you can have that argument. But he's saying that you're tiptoeing around it. You're not really making the argument. And I would respect you if you actually stood on your own 2 feet. But obviously, no one wants to just outright say that. So why are you tiptoeing around it? And this is the whole thing about Karp and Palantir. It's like, we don't tiptoe. We say we don't like Russia and China because of their values, so we don't sell to them. It's just that simple. And that's, one of the reasons I've always looked up to Karp in terms of just like as a human being, you're going to say what you believe in regardless of what anyone else thinks. And eventually, if you get enough people to just believe in what you believe in because you're being honest, you will probably get rewarded for that by the marketplace if you actually just care about what the hell you're talking about because people feel they can trust you.
Spent half my life doing Tai Chi. I really revere Chinese culture, and I would be remiss to say that I, like most Americans, I believe we should have very severe restrictions on exporting our enormous advantage to China. I hope we can reach a place where China and America and its allies can actually work together, but I think we're very far away from that in a harmonious relationship, which is the way a relationship at some point could work. But I think 20 years ago when I said we wouldn't sell our weapons of war to China, it was controversial. In America, that's viewed as a banality. And I think being open about the fact that we're in these at the margin are technologies that can and should be used in the West to defend the West, like in Ukraine, like in Israel. But they are, at the end, weapons, technologies that will define who controls the world order. And I'm very, very in favor of that world order being controlled by the West, primarily by America and its allies. That doesn't mean that we should be xenophobic or engage in bigotry, certainly not in America. And one of the core things we have to avoid in the West is anything that even smacks of something that's xenophobic. That's our core strength, is actually to integrate minorities, of which I include myself. But I do think that we who are tech leaders and business leaders, and I dare say other leaders, should be very clear that we are going to do everything. And I believe technology built in America should only be sold to American allies, and certainly should be made available to all Western governments.
But don't you think one can do both things at the same time?
No.
Because we have an economic security that is being developed, that is being applied. We have our 5G toolbox to make sure that we have trusted vendors. But
Well,
that doesn't
you
prevent
asked-
our president to have a summit with Chinese leaders.
I'm very in favor of summits, and then I believe there are two kind of voters: those who are single issue and those that have no power. And so you're talking about various issues with China, and I'm not an expert in those issues, but I am somewhat of an expert in building weapons of war with software and using AI. And in those things, I do not think there can be transfer of technology. In the other areas, well, we should be in dialogue, and I do think understanding a great and interesting culture that is the culture of China is very important, including for our own development. And doing it a way where we're not xenophobic and open is crucial. But I would draw a bright line there, and I very much do everything.
I think it's a fair point. I mean, Karp's basically saying, yeah, we can engage with China. We're not going to cut them off. Obviously, we have to, given our supply chains that exist, globally within China. But when it comes to weapons of war, technology, etc., there should be a hard, fine line. And I just don't think there is a need to disagree with that. You'll have some people that do disagree with that, but I don't know how you can, given when you see a little bit of what the CCP is doing. A variety of other ways we should engage with them when it comes to trade. But when it comes to war, I don't think you want the Chinese government having some of the weapons that Palantir is building.
I can to see that's enforced. First of all, you have to disambiguate between cyber and a weapons system. So I think what would concern most people in Munich Security Conference, I would imagine, would be how do we find hidden adversaries in a complicated war environment like we have with Russia, where you can actually only field our weapons with enhanced AI software because you're dealing with an emission-suppressed environment. I'm not in favor of regulation in that environment at all, except for to restrict the technologies going to our adversaries. So I don't think that's military technology restricting use. My version of that would be, yes, we should restrict Western companies from selling to adversarial countries. I assume we agree on that, but then in that context, I'm not in favor of restrictions, because basically you're restricting our ability to build it, while of course Russia, China, and Iran are definitively not going to restrict, and I think we probably agree on that, but I think you have to be very, very clear that, and then the more nuanced area is, if you say in the cyber context, restriction is very hard because de facto it's not what we build, but if we were to build cyber attacking devices and you restrict our ability to build them, certainly Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, which are very, very good at building these systems, would have an advantage or they have a disadvantage. Then you get to the consumer internet version, and I mean, restrictions work very well for my product as long as they're fairly applied. And I do think if you ask people in America, there's a somewhat of a concern that these will not be fairly applied because the U.S. tech scene is the dominant in the world. That's less my worry, but if we're being honest about it, that is a concern. And I think it's one that people worry about a lot. I worry about that less. I have one worry as somebody who spent a lot of time in Europe. My dissertation was written in Europe, in Germany. I think of myself in some ways as partially part of the European project and would like to see Europe succeed. In economics, there's something called a paradox of thrift, which is a country that saves too much ends up being poor. It's actually, we classic progressives love this theory because it's one of the reasons we want to spend more. I really worry that the idea, not your idea, but an idea of this legislation is that restrictions will help the European tech scene catch up, which I want. I worry it will backfire because America is currently is just so far ahead. 84% of the top 50 tech companies in the world are American. I would imagine it'll be 95% in 5 years. And if this actually is about protecting consumers, I'm roughly in favor of it. But if it's about protecting the European tech scene, I'm very worried it'll backfire.
And, this is really interesting as well, because what Karp is saying here is that if our goal is to make sure there is innovation in technology, I'm assuming he's talking about particular types of legislation that Germany in uniquely is trying to get out there that can help the tech scene, either through various investments or through spending habits or through saving certain types of money from the government. Karp's argument is like, look, if you think that's going to help consumers, sure. But what's going to help the consumer is not just GDPR, but it's going to be a thriving tech scene. Like, the reason the consumer has so many options in the United States for technology products that we want to use is because there's so many technology companies building for the consumer. So there's competition. In Europe, that's not the case. And if that's not the case in Europe, then you just have American tech companies taking Europeans' audience. And so I think it's really important to listen to what Karp's saying here, especially from the defense perspective. He's trying to get Germany and France, these countries that are spending hundreds of billions on defense that are not procuring Palantir, to recognize that you're not going to have a Palantir that starts in Munich. The Palantir of Germany is not just going to come out of nowhere. You either have to really incentivize it, and if you do incentivize it, they have to be better than us if you actually want to procure that software. And if both of those cases are going to happen, then you're going to have to end up buying Palantir.
And Europe doesn't have a great GDP growth story right now, and I think that is a very big risk. And one of the ways America and Europe are very different. And as somebody who wants Europe to win and owes Europe a lot, I worry about that.
Because what we have seen is that you need competition as the fundamental driver in what you do. But what we have seen in Europe is that has become increasingly difficult because of entrenchment. And the last thing would be to say, you say there are no tech people in government, but it's legitimate for citizens to choose their representatives, and it's legitimate for those representatives to pass legislation.
I'm probably the most prominent critic of Silicon Valley in tech. I completely agree with your criticism of the consumer internet world. I think they're cancerous on our society. I wish we had regulation on them in America. I think TikTok should be banned in America. I think their erudition and corrosion of our cognitive capacities are largely the result of these. I could go on and on. So I agree with you, and bring your legislation to America. I'll support you. But and I do know that there are very technical people in government. I have a very successful business in Denmark and all over Europe, and they're very technical people. But it is an issue for all Western democracies that the technical specificity of large language modules especially exceeds the capacities of all but the most technical people. And that is a problem we all are going to face in every context. And and then on the, I think, and so what I think and obviously in the combative context, we have to find ways to actually share data and share software and share all these things. And the last thing is just a lagging concern that I think all of us who care about Europe have, that there is a tech scene issue. I would love to believe that AI at the edge, which we also believe in, will be more important. But right now there is this issue that is a unspoken issue between America and Europe, where we have lots of issues at home. Everyone's aware of them, but we don't have a GDP growth issue, and the reason we don't is because we have an incredible tech scene, and I do think it would behoove us to find ways, including regulatory, to work better together.
Yes, Michaela Küfter from Deutsche Welle.
That part was also really interesting, because Karp's basically saying, look, I agree with consumer internet, TikTok, all these things are bad for society. That new book he's coming out with, The Technological Republic, is going to be kind of centralizing his focus on his critique on what Silicon Valley's done. However, his argument there is like, You still need technical people in government that are smart. Denmark, which is a place that Palantir has a great business in, Lithuania as well, they have a lot more tech-focused people, whereas his argument is in Germany, you don't really have that. And the sophistication of large language models, which are something very difficult to understand for the average person. It's not just as easy as ChatGPT. There's a lot more of a foundational understanding that even I am trying to learn day by day. You need people in government that actually understand that stuff, because the ramification on those LLMs in every part of our lives, enterprises and consumers, needs to be understood. And Karp's argument is like, Europe's not really doing that yet.
My question is to Mr. Karp. Since you are so aligned with Ms. Vestager on the question of regulation, I wonder whether you as entrepreneur would then also see you in a responsibility to make watertight regulations that would prevent anything like Cambridge Analytica to happen again, or for future election interference with the use of AI.
100%. The Cambridge Analytica thing is completely BS. But I'd be very happy to look. I'm in favor of regulation that gets enforced. To pretend that the arguments that the law is actually always applied fairly and evenly, like in Denmark, in Germany, ist Schwachsinn. And es ist komplett Schwachsinn. Es geht nach hinten los. Und wenn du eine Tech-Szene in Deutschland haben willst, muss man bescheidener mit diesen Regeln und fair mit diesen Regeln umgehen. And obviously,
I don't speak German, but I think I got the gist of it.
Obviously,
me either, but I think he was. You got the gist of his emotions right there. He was trying to say, to assume that the law is applied evenly is probably not the case. It's not happening.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, everybody in my situation, the reason why we're actually in favor of these rules commercially is we know we have the best products. I want your rules to be first. I want transparency. But what I don't want to see is all of a sudden every product can only be the product built in your local country. And zu glauben, dass das nie passiert, ist auch dummes Denken, vorgeschobene Argumente, und du verlierst Menschen wie mich, wie ich, die eben auf der Seite sind von Europa und will Europa verteidigen. And so, of course we need transparency, of course we need these rules, but then they have to be implied. Wittgenstein has this thing that I love. To believe you're following a rule is not to follow a rule. You want the rules? I'm in favor of them. I'll defend them in America with my 50 million followers. They have to actually be applied for real, and they're not always applied for real. And if you want a great example of a place that applies them for real, go to Denmark, watch how they do procurement. You have the Danes in charge of this. I'll be your biggest ally, and so will tech. And that's my real worry. And all these fake, election interference, I'm happy to fight election interference all day and help you do it. But the rule has to be the rule.
I think
this argument is we reacted to Karp's recent conference, his talk at the World Government Conference in the UAE, and he was kind of making the same argument. He's like, yes, fake information is an issue. Yes, election interference is an issue. But what really matters is, at the end of the day, is a government on the board with actually making sure technology is procured in a meaningful way? Do they actually want to ramp up spend? And do they want to ramp up spend on technology that works? Or do they just want to say that they're going to apply some law of fair procurement, and then they never end up procuring the software that makes sense? And what Karp's argument here is that I agree with all the consumer internet stuff that's bad. The problem is, the only way to solve that stuff is if the government takes a stance and actually buys the software that works. And so here he's talking about in Denmark, they have a particular procurement law. That procurement law is meritocratic, which means the best software wins, which is why Karp says, yes, I will defend the regulation against Cambridge Analytica and election interference and all this nonsense, which to him are not the biggest issues in the world. The biggest issues are, if you impose a regulation, will that regulation actually hold up? Will the government actually care to enforce that regulation? And the only way you enforce that regulation is if you procure the software that matches all the regulatory frameworks and guidelines you're talking about. Guess what? Palantir's software does. Palantir software is built with GDPR in mind. Palantir is honestly some of the only software that should be allowed in Europe in regards to high-tech defense spending, because a lot of the companies that are trying to build that type of defense tech software don't have the technical capabilities that Palantir has, or meet the regulatory frameworks that Palantir is building their entire software with, and they have been building it for 20 years in regards to civil liberties and data protection. So when Karp says, yeah, I'm a proponent of regulation, it's because he knows they're going to win, because if you regulate and then you have to procure software based on that regulation, Palantir is the end result. They're the only ones that have the best tech and that match the regulations. But the problem is his critique in his German language right there is that that's not what the government does, which means it just becomes this like hypocritical thing, virtue signal that makes you feel good, but it doesn't actually materialize into reality. So overall, this was a really good 12 minutes by Karp. He's done a lot of new interviews over the past couple of weeks. It's going to be really exciting to see how this plays out going into Q1 earnings for 2024. He obviously seems very bombastic, very excited. He seems like international growth may be coming. And he also seems like he understands his message and his argument in terms of his critique of what's going on in software, particularly Silicon Valley, and where Palantir differs from his critique. So it's been a fun couple weeks for Palantir. Markets open back tomorrow on Tuesday. Let's see what happens with price consolidation and then NVIDIA earnings on Wednesday. That'll be live on the channel. That'll be a big one for Palantir. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow.